Oi, what's happening? I'm Eddie, the Skinhead Gourmet. Tonight, we're talking about knives.
Esa sensación, a ese trance hipnótico que me hace viajar. Te llevo en mi mente y en mi imaginación. Escucho tu voz y empiezo a sangrar. Letras y palabras hacen fusión, apretando el botón.
What's happening? So we're talking about knives today on the Skinhead Gourmet. Before I even talk about a single blade, I want to talk about at least one thing everybody who owns one needs to have, and there's probably at least two. If you want to go the full bore, you get all three. But if you're going to own a nice knife, first thing you need to do is get a nice sharpening stone. At minimum, one dual-sided coarse and fine grit, so you can keep your stuff sharp. You can always go and get them sharpened at your local knife store. It's going to add up over time. If you get your own, you learn how to use it, you're going to keep your knives sharp and in good shape for longer, and you can control the edge. A lot of chefs would prefer to kind of put a custom angle to it instead of a lot of Western knives will have what's called a 50-50 bevel, where it's exactly 50% of an angle on both sides. That's not always what you want. I personally prefer a more Asian style edge, where it's like a 70-30, where it's basically you're making very much a right-handed knife. Unless you're left-handed, then it goes the other way. But this way you can control the edge you have, and the more familiar you get with your blade, the better a chance you have of knowing what it is you like and how you're going to be comfortable. For sure, the most important thing you can get is an honing steel. This is not a sharpening tool, as a lot of people may believe incorrectly. This will not put an edge on your knife, but when you have a knife with a decent edge and you use it, what you do is you're following the edge, the angle of the edge, and what you're doing is you're just keeping the edge sharp. What happens is when a knife gets used, there's a tiny little microscopic layer of metal that'll actually curl over a little bit, and you're going to true your blade and make it sharp and keep everything straight so that it maintains a sharpness over time. Another thing that you can get is what's called a diamond steel, which is an actual sharpening steel. With a knife like this, you can actually go and you can put an edge on it. It's a different metal, it's a different grain, and you would run it just like you would with a sharp or a honing steel, but doing this, you'd actually be able to put an edge on your blade. It's easier to use than a stone, but it's not always as good, does as good of a job. One thing you may have noticed is the beginning of the show I had a shot of basically my work kit. This is what I take with me to and from work every day. I work in a professional kitchen where I have a variety of different tasks to do, and there is truth to the saying there's a knife for every job. If you're cooking at home, you don't necessarily need such a wide assortment, and for a lot of people it's a big investment. I probably have hundreds of dollars, if not more, in steel here. If you have to buy yourself just one knife for the home, there's basically two choices that I would say are definitely excellent. The first would be of a Japanese origin. It's called a santoku, which translates to three virtues because it's good for slicing, chopping, and dicing. It's an excellent all-purpose knife. I've bought 3 of these in the recent years and I've ended up giving away 2 to other chefs who've lost their blades, because if you have to have one, this is an excellent choice to have. It's very versatile, it's good for most jobs you'll have to do at home. It's comfortable, it's usually of a nice size, and with the little sheep's foot shaped blade, it's good for rocking back and forth for your dicing. It'll maintain a nice edge. With a santoku you always want a thin spine, you don't want a thick blade. You want something that's going to sail through whatever you're cutting easily. If you would prefer to go for a more Western style knife, the traditional German or French style chef's knife. This little guy here is probably nice for the home. It's as small of a chef's knife as I would recommend. You want an 8 or 10 inch. I know I've had chefs before tell me, the smaller the knife, the more likely you are to cut yourself because you're making more movements. Now at work, my favorite would be my 12 inch. And this guy here holds a beautiful edge, and it's good for just about anything I'm going to do except for, fine fish work and a couple of specialty jobs. And also good if you have crackhead neighbors, excellent for scaring them away from your front door. Well, we've talked about your basic all-purpose knife if you've got to have one. But there are specialty jobs, and sometimes if you're like myself, maybe you like to collect them, you want to have a few, or you have a wide variety of jobs that you want a special knife for. And I'm going to go through at least what I have, and what I've found has basically been able to carry me through just about anything I need to do on a regular basis. One very handy knife to have would be like a serrated bread knife. If you're going to have just one, you're going to want something at least 7, 8, this is a 9-inch. It's good for breaking down bread, also great for cutting like lettuce, if you have heads of lettuce, because it'll sail through very easily. It maintains an edge very well because of the little serrated teeth. It's not going on just having a fine piece of metal that's ground to a thin point, but these guys are a little bit more resilient, but it's also not quite as good for making a fine cut or a clean cut. Sometimes it can be a little bit rougher on whatever you're taking it to. Another wonderful all-purpose knife, the Choi Do, or Chinese knife or Chinese cleaver. Not to be confused with a traditional meat cleaver, and you can always tell the difference by the size of the spine. A traditional meat cleaver is going to be very thick. It's a heavy blade used for breaking bone and separating large hunks of meat. This is actually a Chinese vegetable knife, which is wonderful to be used as a chef's knife. You can cut vegetables with it. It's great for chopping, slicing, and dicing, much like the Santoku. And it's a very comfortable knife to use, despite how big it looks. You can actually get some very, very fine work out of it. And personally, I like to keep mine on an almost 90-10 angle, where it's very much right-handed, and you get a very fine edge, or a fine cut from the single cutting edge. But it's a wonderful knife to have. It definitely has an intimidating look to it, and it's not quite intimidating to use. It's actually very comfortable. It's great if you have to chop for long periods of time. The holiday season may be coming up. You have a lot of stuff to cut. You get this guy, and it's surprisingly comfortable in your hands so long as the knife's weighted well. And you can usually tell that by, if you hold it like this, you shouldn't feel heavier on either side. You want it to feel kind of balanced. The handle and the blade should weigh about the same, or a little extra weight towards the blade. But some other fun guys we have, if you're doing any sort of meat or fish fabrication, I'm always a fan of my little 8-inch boner, but I really love my 10-inch boner, especially because it has the curve at the tip. But I've used these when I worked in a commercial fish house. You can break down an entire 250-pound bluefin tuna with this guy alone, and you can do it in just a few minutes. You keep a nice edge on it. It's got a little bit of flex to it. It's not a super hard edge. For any sort of fillet or boning knife, you want to get something that's got some flex to it, because you have things to move around. Something that's too hard is going to be brittle, and it may break if you have to bend it a little bit. And you also have basically their little brother, the traditional fillet knife. This one's actually the favorite one I found. I bought in a tackle shop. Keeps a wonderful razor sharp edge on it. This is great for breaking down chickens, smaller fish. We're doing a lot of meat work if you're just trying to trim steaks or a pork tenderloin or something easy like that. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my smaller specialty knives that I'm a big fan of. This guy here would be a paring knife. Wonderful for doing small batches of fine vegetable work, fruit work, anything where you just need a small fine edge. If you're cutting lemon crowns, cucumber cups, radish rosettes, something that's going to be easily maneuverable around a small area. It's going to have a sharp little edge, and it's easy to just kind of grab when you need something right away. Also, I have my very well used clam and oyster knives. If you're not popping shellfish, these guys won't do you very much good. But if you have to, these guys are a must. A clam knife, you can tell, usually has a little bit of a bladed edge and somewhat blunt at the tip. Whereas an oyster knife, you can see there's a little curve, it has a point, but there's absolutely no blade here because you're popping a hinge and just basically loosening the actual muscle inside from the shell. And now on to one of my favorites. Over the years I've developed a deep, deep love for Japanese steel, Japanese style knives. I've had a few experiences where I've actually had to use them in their proper applications, and it's always been fun, and it takes a different level of technical ability to be able to actually execute a lot of Japanese cuts. And the Japanese have a somewhat different sense as to what they like. The Santoku is basically their version of a westernized knife, whereas you can find something like your nakiri knife or a yusuba, which is basically a vegetable knife. It's got the blunt edge, which is wonderful if you're working in close quarters, especially because there's nothing at the tip that you can accidentally poke yourself with. This is basically a slicing and chopping knife, great for quick slices, not bad for chopping, but it's a wonderful, great knife for vegetables, not a whole lot else. You can use it for meats. It's not the best knife in the world, but it's far from the worst. But then there's also some of my favorites, my sushi knives, which you can tell if you look at them. You have the one side has the bevel, the one side is completely flat. This is going to give you a sharper, thinner, finer cut. It's a little bit trickier to keep sharp properly, but if you do, you've got a razor sharp knife that can cut, you can cut tuna basically paper thin to the point where you can see through it. This would be a sashimi knife, which is traditionally used to cut sashimi. Raw fish that's going to be presented very artfully, very technically, and very beautifully, and you need to be able to make a smooth cut. The length of the knife is basically so it's only one cut. You want to make a single draw without a sawing motion, because when doing so you'll leave a wave in the fish where you can make one clean cut. It's smooth, it has a beautiful texture, and it comes out very pretty. I also have which is called a unagi knife. It's basically an eel knife, but it's a very handy little all-purpose sushi knife. I've used this to make sashimi as well. It's a little bit shorter, it's a little bit more maneuverable. It fits beautifully in the hand. It's actually nice for cleaning chicken if you're in a jam. But it's a very comfortable, handy knife to get, and usually you can find them somewhat on the cheaper side. And it's much easier to get started with than the much larger sashimi knife, which can seem a little bit unwieldy to people. One thing you may notice with some of my knives, you'll see different steels. Now this is my nakiri knife that's actually made by a Western manufacturer, and it's definitely more Western style in the steel used. This would be of German manufacture, and one thing you'll notice with German knives, they're very durable. They're great if you're taking them to work because it's a somewhat softer steel, which makes it have a little bit more give to it, and although the edge may not stay quite as well, it's very easy to put back, but it's also not a brittle knife. It'll take a lot of abuse. This is one of my favorite nakiri knives, but if you can get a close look, you can see the beautiful marking in the steel. This is what's called Damascus. It's actually a layered steel. It's a very, very old technique, and it makes for a very beautiful, artful knife, but it also makes for a very, very hard knife, which makes it, you can basically abuse it a bit, and it'll keep a very sharp edge. The only problem with it is the metal is very, very hard, which means that if it drops, it's more likely to chip because the harder steel is going to be brittle. But these are wonderful knives, especially if you're looking to collect or you want something that's just very pretty for a professional use. They're gorgeous. They are a little bit more prone to rust, so you have to clean and dry them properly before you put them away, or you will get spots. But you definitely end up with something that's very pretty to look at. And if you're going to be creating beautiful food, having a beautiful tool can always help. Well, thanks for tuning in. I hope you had some fun watching me talk about one of my favorite things in the world, knives. Always happy to play with them, love using them. Knife work is one of my favorite aspects of being a chef. It's always fun to challenge yourself to make it more precise, smaller, better, more uniform. A lot of times on the show you see my very quick, at-home knife skill. It's definitely not something that would be acceptable at work. And at home a lot of times you can skimp on it. But one thing I can tell you is if you want to make beautiful food, sometimes a very sharp knife is the first step to getting there before the skill. If the blade doesn't cut, you're going to have a harder time. You're going to have to work more, and you'll end up developing bad habits to compensate for it. Whereas with a sharp knife, usually the rule of thumb is if you can hold it with 2 fingers and let the blade do the work, you should be doing fine. It's not something you need to push, muscle, or put a whole lot of effort into. Your tool should be doing the work for you. And a lot of times that comes down to choosing the right tool for the job. Thanks again for watching. Oi, I'm Eddie the Skinhead Gourmet.
Despiertan los sentidos una revolución, no hay freno alguno, una locomoción.